Welcome to another Blender Cookie tutorial. My name is Kent Trammell, and in this video we're going to be taking another look at realistic skin shading with Blender. So far we've walked through this subject twice already, once in depth with the Blender internal render engine in the realistic head series, and then we briefly touched on it with cycles in the Pancake Hobo course. But thus far we haven't gone in depth with skin shading in cycles yet. So that's what I want to do. Now, if you've watched any of my training before, hopefully you know right away that the first order of business is taking time to observe reality. And for human skin, this is especially necessary because everyone sees human skin every day and subconsciously knows precisely how it's supposed to look. That's why it's so hard for CG artists to get right, because if it's the slightest bit off, we all can tell and the illusion is broken. However, understanding why human skin looks the way it does is another story, knowledge that isn't so common. So please study as many reference photographs as you can if you want to create a believable skin material. But since I have gone over skin observations before in the Pancake Hobo course, I'm only going to hit the basics here. But if you want a more detailed explanation, please go see the skin lesson in that course. Okay, so the buzzword when it comes to skin shading is subsurface scattering. And this is basically a fancy term for translucency. If we take a look at this reference photograph, it's a very typical studio lighting setup with very harsh back and rim lights, which are pushing a lot of light through the ear here. And this is typically when it comes to subsurface scattering and human skin, most people look straight at the ears because that's where the effect is most noticeable, and you can get a very bright orangish red glow. And this color is what bleeds through the shadows and softens the shadows. Notice here at the nose, if we zoom way in, and then if I just right click and hover over the edge of our shadow, notice just how red the color is. That's actually happening on all the shadows across the skin. And this is the key thing that I want you to take away from this observation and that we will need to recreate. As we pull back out, in general, the effects of subsurface causes a softening of the shadows and therefore a softening of the skin detail. And as far as the orangish red color, that's coming from different layers underneath the surface of the skin, like blood, like muscle, and fatty tissue that combine to give us that color as the light scatters through it. And with all that in mind, let's jump into Blender and take a look at the assets we have to start with. So this comes from a personal project that I did a couple years ago. It's a slightly stylized elderly man head. And the reason I want to use this is, number one, there is a ton of detail built into the geometry through a multi-resolution modifier up to level 5. If we jump up to that level, you'll see all the skin and pore detail that I've included in the actual geometry. You can see how heavy it is, considering the viewport sluggishness now. And it's important that this is included in the geometry, meaning that it's breaking the silhouette. It's not only included in a bump map or some kind of cheat, but it's actually affecting the shape of the geometry. This will help to ensure a more believable subsurface scattering effect. So let's bump that back down to, let's say, level 2. And along with this very detailed piece of geometry, I also have all the texture maps that I painted specifically for human skin. Things like epidermal texture map and subdermal texture map, bump maps, subsurface scale maps, specular maps. All the textures that I would need for a realistic skin shader I've already created. It just needs to be plugged into a shader appropriately. So before we actually create the shaders, let's go through the render setups that I have. I'm just going to split my user interface over here to give me a very small render viewport. And I should have a camera. Let's hit 0. There we go. Making sure that I'm in the Cycles render engine, I'll go ahead and enable viewport rendering, or Shift Z in that viewport. And we have a black silhouette because I have no lights visible. So let's jump over to my layer management add-on and enable layer Ren A, which is my first lighting scenario. Pretty standard stuff with a strong key light, a back/rim light, and then a large card which acts as a sort of global rim light that will show up particularly well with reflections. And then let's go to the next one, Rin B. This is actually very similar, except I would change the world value. So let me go choose a environment map. I will, of course, include some environment maps in the source files. And okay, so if I bump this up to, let's say, 0.5, now we have a lot of environment lighting contributing to our shadows, lightening them up a whole lot. And then finally, we have render scenario C, which if I, let's see, turn off my environment light again, this setup is useful for looking at how backscattering works through the ears and if my subsurface values are good. So yeah, the reason I show you these is in order to get the best skin material, you'll want to look at the shading through different light setups. And if it looks good in all the lighting situations, then you can have confidence in your material. So I think I'll start with scenario A, just because it's a little bit more neutral and standard. And let's get started building materials. I'll switch my 3D viewport to the node editor with the N key. And right now I have one of my cards selected, but if I select my head geometry over here, we have no material associated. So let's create one, and I'm going to call this skin_simple, because I'm going to walk you through a couple different skin shading setups. Obviously I named this one simple, so the first one is going to be a fairly bare bones approach, just using the subsurface scattering node and textures associated with the model. And then after that, I'll show you a more complex approach to subsurface scattering, specifically for skin, with Matt Heimlich's port of the Arnold skin shader, which has all the bells and whistles of 3-layer skin shading that you may be familiar with if you come from Vray, Mental Ray, or obviously Arnold. But being more complex means that it actually renders about half the speed as the simple setup, and you can actually get a very believable result with the simple setup. But still, I think it's good to know both ways. So now let's introduce our subsurface scattering node with Shift-A, Shader, Subsurface Scattering, and we'll remove our diffuse BSDF and plug in the BSSRDF output into the surface input. And immediately we can see in our viewport that way too much light is now penetrating the surface and scattering around. It's glowing way too much. So the first setting I usually tweak is going to be this scale value right here, where the higher the value, the easier it is for light to penetrate and the further through the surface it can penetrate. The lower the value, the harder it is for light to pass through the surface, and it doesn't go quite as deep. So let's bump this down to 0.1, and you'll see that less light is able to make it all the way through the object, and our shadows appear. And if we go down a little bit more, let's go to 0.05, cut it in half. Our shadows get even darker, and more of our model starts to appear while we still have a lot of light shining through, especially in the ears, because they're the thinnest part of our head mesh. But that's still a little bit too high. How about 0.03? I think that's going to be a good value based on my exploration of this shader. And now with that dialed in, it'll be a lot easier to go over these settings, which I will quickly run through. First, we have the fall-off algorithm that we can select, where I kind of look at these in reverse order from bottom to top, where compatible is the old algorithm that's about to be phased out and removed from trunk, so we don't need to worry about that at all. And we're going to be left with cubic and Gaussian. Cubic is a sharper fall-off based on the documentation, and it actually renders a little bit faster, but then Gaussian is slightly more complex of an algorithm, so it takes a little bit longer to render, but it's perhaps a little bit more physically accurate, though when I compare the two, I really don't see any noticeable difference, aside from a slight render time savings with cubic. So I'm going to select that. It is the default, or it should be. And below that we have color, and this is the general color of our object. So if we, let's see, switch that to, let's see, zoom out here, switch that to green, You know, it looks like a green object that scatters, which is probably pretty obvious to you. Of course, that's what that does. But with subsurface scattering, if we jump down, we've already addressed the scale option here. Below that, we have radius. And this is where we control what color the scattered light becomes. So if you remember that reference image we just looked at, in the shadowed areas on the edges, I pointed out how red the shadows were. And this is the scattered color glowing through the shadows. And with skin, it happens to be red. So if we open up those options, we have 3 values with really no description. But the first one is the red value, the second one is a green value, and the third is the blue value. So RGB, which gives us an overall color. So again, with skin, we're looking for a red color. So let's leave the first value at 1 and then start to decrease the green and blue, which should leave us with more red. So let's bump these down to half, 0.5 and 0.5. And you'll start to see that we get an overall green color of our object, but the light that passes through causes it to glow red. And I think I want it to be a little bit more orange. Let's remove the green color, take saturation all the way down to 0. Okay, yeah, so I don't have any green interfering, and it's clearly a very red color. So in the radius, let's bump down my blue value. So now we have a little bit more green in the mix, which should take it closer to orange. What if I bump that up to 0.6? Yeah, we're starting to get a little bit closer to orangish yellow, but still mainly red. All right, I think that's good for the radius. That is a very important setting. I would say radius and scale are the most important, but we have a couple more options. Below radius, we have sharpness. Now, what I can tell sharpness does is kind of the same thing as decreasing scale. But just to support my theory on what it does, let's go ahead and do a couple renders. Number 1, we will render this with sharpness turned off. Then let's switch to, let's go to slot 7 and go back to the node editor by hitting escape. And let's change our sharpness all the way up to a value of 1 and render that again. And now if we switch between slot 8 and 7, you can see in slot 8 that the details, especially in the forehead, around the eyes, and well, generally the front of the face, it gets a little bit blurrier. But then at 7, they sharpen up a bit, but also there seems to be more light passing through the ears. The glow gets a little bit brighter. So changing the sharpness setting is not exactly the same as simply dialing down the scale, but it's some sort of in-between that tries to sharpen the details of the geometry while still maintaining that scatter amount. And jumping back to the node editor, I usually leave sharpness off because I kind of think it detracts from the believability a little bit. But below that we have texture blur, and this really only is noticeable when we're using a texture because it does exactly what you would expect. It blurs that image. And the idea behind this is, if you read the docs, it states how, for example, if we used a photograph to create our textures, it's already blurred. There's already blurring happening within the subsurface effect because the picture is of subsurface skin. Whereas if we hand paint a texture, we might not necessarily build that in. And especially if we use a procedural, we'll want to blur based on the subsurface scattering algorithm. And that's really where this comes in handy. So I rarely ever touch the texture blur setting. And that is all for the features of the subsurface scattering node. Do note that if we switch to Gaussian, we lose the sharpness option, which again lends itself to me believing that sharpness is more of a cheat effect rather than being physically accurate. But anyway, other than that, that's all for the subsurface scattering node. And we're ready to plug in our textures. So I'm going to add an input texture coordinate node way over here off to the left, and then add input, not input, texture, image texture. And first we're going to load our general head color texture. Let's enable thumbnails so we can see exactly what we're looking for. And this is what I want, head color right here. And then let's plug in our UV to the vector. and the color of our image into the color of our subsurface scattering node. And right away, it looks a little bit more human, though in general, the whole texture feels a little bit too orange. So let's add a, color RGB curves node in between the image color output and the subsurface scattering node. And for the red channel, I'm going to take the right upper corner and just drag it down a little bit, then jump to the green channel and drag that down about half as much. Yeah, that feels a little bit more natural. Maybe a little less red. There we go. That feels better. And that's really it for having a texture plugged into subsurface scattering color. But we can also use textures for everything else. So I'm going to show you what a scale texture does. And with Shift-Control-D to duplicate the image texture node while maintaining the connection to the texture coordinate node. And let's go open another texture that I have already created. And I have two different versions of this. It's called SSS Scale and SSS Scale B. Now, Scale B was procedurally created by simply inverting the head mesh and then baking an ambient occlusion map that will conveniently give you darkened areas around the thinnest portions of the mesh, like the ears, the eyelids, the nose, and the lips, which is, if you want to control the scale, that's where you're going to want to control it. So that one's pretty cool, but this first one is what I'll use, and it's just simply hand-painted around the ears and the eyes. So let's go with that one. Both of them will be included in the source files for you to play with. But okay, so now if we plug this directly into the scale value, there will be absolutely no subsurface taking place in the majority of the head, as you can tell. But then the eyes, which is painted to be 0.5 value gray, that has a scale of 0.5, so we see scattering there, and then we see a lot of scattering around the ears, which of course doesn't look realistic at all. So we need to dial in that value and mix it with a Shift-A color RGB, mix RGB node. And let's, for the top color swatch, I'm going to copy the scale value that I was happy with, 0.03. Hover over it, hit Control-C, and then click on the color swatch. And for the value, let's paste that in there. And then for the operation, let's choose Add, because once I add the color from our SSS scale texture, it will, any areas that are black will add nothing to this value. So the majority of the head will stay at 0.03. And then anything above 0 will simply be added, increasing the scale, allowing more light to scatter through it, like the ears, which is what we want. So let's plug in the color to color swatch number 2, and then plug the color into the scale value, giving us continued subsurface effect all over the mesh, but it's much more concentrated in the ears and the eyes. So here's where we have the option to adjust the factor and dial in how much of that scattering that we want. So let's go way down. Let's go to 0.1. And that's still too much. How about 0.02? There we go. That's a little bit better. Certainly easy to dial in if we want more scattering in the ears, which is, something common that people like to do. Let's see here. I wonder how we're looking with our other lighting scenarios. Let's disable render A and take a look at render B. Yeah, that looks pretty good from that angle. How about C, which is basically just a backlight? It's still looking good, still looking subsurface scattery. So that's, great. I'll stick with render B for a little while. I think that's my favorite lighting setup. And jump back over to the node editor, because the only component that's missing from my simplistic subsurface skin material is the specular component. So if we add a shader, glossy BSDF, and then mix it, let's see, shader, mix shader node, mix it with our subsurface, we'll start to get some reflections, which are certainly a necessary part of a skin shader. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but with reflections comes Fresnel. So let's create that component now. Shift A, input layer weight, Shift A, vector, let's see, not vector, I'm sorry, converter color ramp. Plug in our facing value into the factor of our color ramp. And just to, let's see, dial this in, let's plug it into an emission node first before using it to control the factor of our mix shader node. There we go. Let's switch our interpolation to B-spline and drag our lower dark flag up. Yeah, to be like that. And now plug this into the color output into the factor value of our mix shader. Plug that back into the surface so we can see our specular component now. I think that's looking a whole lot better, but I would like to take this one step further and also use this color ramp to control the roughness value of our glossy BSDF so that as our geometry faces away from the camera, which is increasing the amount of the glossy BSDF, which is why we get this nice rim light, I also want it to decrease the roughness value, making it more shiny. So let's add a color mix node, and let's make the top color swatch the value of the surface that's facing more directly at the camera. Let's change that to 0.3. And then for color swatch number 2, let's change that to be much lower, to be more shiny. And let's try 0.01 for that. Then the color of our color ramp goes into the factor, and this color goes into the roughness. And then let's do a test with and without it. First, without. And, oh, okay, I messed up something. Let's go back. I also need another mix node like this one to control the factor a little bit more, because right now it's black, you know, for the faces that are for the surface that's facing the camera more directly, so there's no reflection happening, which is clearly not accurate. So we'll plug that color ramp into the factor of another mix node, and the top value needs to be, let's say 0.1, and then the bottom value needs to be let's go 0.5. That might be a little bit strong in both areas. Let's go 0.3 in the bottom and 0.05 in the top. Yeah, let's give that a shot. There we go. That's much better with the glossy clearly showing up on the front of the forehead, front of the nose, and also the lips. That's certainly helping our skin out. That's without the roughness mapped. Now let's jump to slot 6 and plug in our mix node for our roughness value. And render again. And here we have a much more subtle glossy effect, but this is how we can control how sweaty our character is. So if we go to slot 7, you know, he looks a little bit shinier, a little bit more sweaty. Slot 6, you know, not so much. So we can tweak those values. I think I would tweak the values for, let's see, the upper slot to be, let's see, 0.25 instead of 3. And then maybe increase the factor, how much gloss is being added. Right now the value is 0.05. I would increase that. Let's see, I'll actually increase that to 0.1, double it, and then leave the roughness as is at 0.3. And then perhaps bring in a little bit more reflection on the sides of the head with this bottom value over here from 0.3. Let's go to 0.4. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Do one more render, jumping back to the UV image editor. Let's put this in slot 5. Yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with that. Switching back to slot 6, then slot 5. More reflections or a higher gloss value on top of the subsurface, I think works good. What we want is a nice balance when it comes to skin, where with subsurface, the details will be washed out basically. That's how it should be. And the way we get them back is with, you know, specular reflections. It really gives you a sense of the depth that the light is penetrating. So that's definitely a key part, is striking the balance between specular and subsurface. But yeah, that's essentially all of my components for this simplistic subsurface shader using the subsurface node. And if we go back to the node editor, I have all kinds of places to plug another map in. For example, let's add a bump map, Shift-Control-D, my image texture. Go grab that texture map, SSS bump right here. And to test this out, let's unplug our color from the subsurface scattering node and leave it, oh whoops, that was the scale. Let's unplug the color texture so that it's white. And at this point I need to do render previews at a higher resolution to see more detail. So I'm going to bump that up from 50% of the render res to 100%, and also increase my samples. Well, no, I won't do that quite yet. I still want, optimized renders for the previews. And anyway, so the bump map is going to be plugged directly into our displacement output of our material. And how about we make a little bit more room over here? Right away, I know that my bump is going to be way too strong, or at least usually it is. So let's try doing a render as is and see if we need to dial the bump down at all. Okay, it might be kind of hard to tell because it's still a fairly grainy render. That's another thing about subsurface. It needs more samples to clean up. And since my bump map is basically pore detail, you can't tell the difference between pores and noise. So I also didn't render a before comparison. So let me do that real quick before we start to dial in the bump map. Jump to slot 5 and disconnect the bump image texture. There we go. Here is before, 4 is after. So there's quite a large change, and it's almost like the face sort of mushes and melts a little bit once the bump is applied, and that's because the bump is way too strong. So let's jump back to our node editor and add a converter math node where we can plug our bump texture into. Here is where we can change our operation to multiply and change the multiplied value down here to make it 0.1 of the original intensity of the map. Now let's plug that into our displacement output and try rendering again. Here we are with a bump map added. Let's see if we can even tell a difference. We can certainly see a shift, but can't really distinguish the extra detail due to the noise. But this will be really good when I render my final high sample, high resolution image. But for demonstration purposes, I'm really just showing you how I go about dialing in these values. And now that I have the bump dialed in, I can reconnect my color texture to the subsurface scattering node. And then lastly, if I want to be thorough, I can duplicate my image texture node again, Shift-Control-D. And this will become my specular map. Keep in mind, all of these maps I showed you how to create in the Realistic Head series. So if you went through that, you should already have a detailed head model with detailed textures like this to accompany it that you can just plug directly into cycles to get that updated subsurfacey goodness like we're doing here. I don't want you to think I'm just breezing through these textures and happen to have all of them. It's a fairly involved process that you can see in the Realistic Head series. But anyway, the last map I'll show you is the spec map. And if we plug this into an emission node to see exactly what we're dealing with, you can see that it's based on the color map with that's been converted to a black and white value map. And we have some highlighted areas of white around the eyelids to give us more of a wet eyelid kind of look. Also in the lips, we want those to be a little bit more reflective due to their wetness. But then in general, we just have a breakup of the skin specularity. So we're going to plug this into a, color mix RGB node and use the image as the factor. And then from there, we will choose colors that we want to be our low value and our high value. For this top color swatch, which will be the lowest value of specularity, let's make that 0.3, and then take it towards the blue direction a little bit, about like that. Because when it comes to human skin, it helps to take the specular reflections into the blue spectrum just a little bit. Let's copy that color swatch now with hovering over it and hitting Control-C, then pasting it with Control-V over the next color swatch, and let's take that value from 0.3 all the way up to 1. And now we have that variation in the specular map, but we have a little bit more control over it, and we don't want the lower value to be 0. We still want it to reflect a little bit, but I tend to make my controlling maps be black and white because that's easier for me to understand as I make the maps. And also I see how easy it is to plug it into a mix node and dial in specific values after the fact, like here in the shading network. But anyway, now that I have that set up, let's plug that into our glossy color. And that should help to break up our glossy component of the skin very realistically, because before this it was very uniform across the entire head, and breaking that up certainly will help with realism. So at this point, I think I'm happy with my shader based on the preview down here, and I will, let's increase my samples for a final render from 500 to 1000, and hopefully be done with this simplistic skin shader. And at about 6.5 minutes, which really isn't too bad, considering we're at a fairly high resolution and certainly a lot of samples. It's a pretty good representation of skin, I think, but like everything, it could of course use some more tweaking. But at this point, I'm fairly satisfied, and I would begin to do test renders in different lighting conditions. One thing that I notice can affect a skin material more than you might expect is the environment light. So let's switch to slot number 3 and enable my world environment texture, which is currently at a strength of 0, so it's basically turned off. What if we switch that to number 1, and it's clearly way too strong, so let's go to 0.5. And this represents more of a daytime rendering scenario. And while this looks pretty good, typically environment lights, once they are introduced, I'll have to go back and readdress my subsurface settings because it needs to look good in both lighting conditions. But I suppose at this point I'm pretty satisfied with the simplistic version of the skin shader. And I know I'm calling it simplistic, but if we take a look at the node editor, some might not call this simplistic because we have a lot of nodes in here, but that's mainly due to the textures that I'm using. Because as far as subsurface goes, it's just one node. One layer, if you will. It's very common when it comes to skin shaders to have a tri-layer system, which I went over with Blender Internal in the Realistic Head series. And if you come from Mental Ray or Vray or other high-end render engines, you'll be familiar with the tri-layer system. That's where it can get really complex. And in Blender, again, Matthew Heimlich has ported Arnold's complex shader into Blender as a node group, and that's what I'm going to show you next. But if you feel satisfied with the result that I'm kind of showing you and feel satisfied with the range of options that you have to tweak just the subsurface scattering node by itself, then this is a good option for you. It's what I tend to do, namely because I'm satisfied with the result, and this next method, the complex Arnold port shader, takes almost twice the amount of time to render and clean up. But it does give you all those options that you're used to if you come from one of those commercial render engines. So that is what the next lesson is about. In this lesson, we're going to explore a more complex approach to skin shading in cycles using the Arnold port shader network that was built by Matthew Heimlich, who has done a few Blender Cookie tutorials for us. But he built it based on the Arnold skin shader, which is a render engine that's developed by Solid Angle, and now I believe it's proprietary to Sony Pictures ImageWorks, and it's being used on all their modern films like the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs films, as well as the Amazing Spider-Man reboot. So it's a very new engine that's garnered a lot of respect in the modern industry. And anyway, Matthew Heimlich knows personally one of the developers who kind of helped him work out this shader node that mimics the math and internal workings of the Arnold skin material. And if you come from other high-end render engines like Vray or Vray that uses standard tri-layer subsurface scattering for skin, then this shader network will be more familiar to you than simply the subsurface scattering cycles node. So anyway, I've included this material with the source files, and we will need to append that into our scene. So let's go to File, Append, and let's go find the file. It's called arnoldskin.blend. If we click that, then go to the material folder, you'll see it in there, Skin Complex. And now if we go find that material to apply it to our head, you will see this mishmash of settings in this gigantic node. And if you don't have any experience with the previously mentioned tri-layer skin materials, then this is going to look crazy to you. But if you do have experience with them, then you should recognize a lot of the settings here, where we have diffuse color, we have shallow, mid, and deep subsurface scattering layers. We have primary gloss and secondary gloss. If you're an experienced artist, then you should know exactly what to do with all these settings. And it gives you all that detailed control that you're used to. So let's dive in and enable viewport rendering over here in my small rendering viewport. And first thing we'll see is, at least with this scene and with the scale of this head, we'll see that the scale, the default of 0.85 is a little bit too high. So let's bump that down to 0.2, let's say. Okay, what about 0.1? Well, truthfully, it's really hard to tell what's the right scale and how to dial that in, partly because our skin looks extremely blown out, like our light is just 10 times the power that it needs to be. However, this is the same lighting from the previous lesson, which I know had good values. And if we zoom in here and look at the eyes, you'll notice that they are not blown out. So this tells me that it has something to do with the shader. And there could be a couple things wrong with it. Number one, I want to take a look at the diffuse weight versus the subsurface scattering weight. Okay, because the shader comes with a set of default settings, including what the shallow, mid, and deep colors are, what their scatter radiuses are. You can see here that they're all different, as well as default specularity settings. So in order to dial this in, I really need to go one by one. So I will turn off my specular weights down here. Primary glossy, let's turn that to 0. Secondary glossy, turn that to 0 as well. And then go all the way back up here to diffuse weight versus subsurface weight. So let's start by turning off my subsurface weight. And you'll see there that we lose our overblown lighting. So what if we do the opposite? Let's turn off diffuse and enable subsurface. And while it is still overblown a little bit, it's not nearly as bad as when the diffuse was combined with the subsurface. So what I'm going to assume from this is that diffuse and overall subsurface weight, they both should not be 1. So what if we go 0.5 and 0.5? This certainly seems to work out a lot better. But at the forehead specifically, it still seems a little bit overblown. And I think part of that is the diffuse color, which is 0.8, almost white. So if we take that down to 0.5, this starts to look a lot better and it's not quite so overblown. But why do we even have a diffuse setting here? Because in the simplistic version of the shader, I only used a subsurface node. There was no diffuse element at all. And if you read the documentation that Matthew provided on the Blender Artist thread, he recommends that the diffuse color is for the overall head color texture. So let's add that. Shift A, texture, image texture, and also we need a texture coordinate node. Let's plug in the UVs to the vector and go grab that map. Here we are, head color. And we'll plug that into our diffuse color swatch. And we can start to see a little bit of that flesh tone come through. If we zoom in here on the eyebrow, specifically I'm looking here because remember my eyebrow was included in the texture from when I photo sourced from a person's face. So there is an eyebrow texture mapped to the eyebrow, but we can barely see it. And this is partly due to our diffuse weight is at 0.5. So we come to a bit of a problem here where if I have this at 1, we'll see the full value of the texture. But if we have it at 1, it's overblown and we can't really use those values. So if you ask me, I don't really see a lot of reason to use the diffuse weight, especially with the color map in my personal experience, because this is a subsurface skin shader. And as soon as I start to add diffuse weight, I'm simply removing the attributes of subsurface scattering. So I personally don't see a place for a diffuse map when trying to achieve the look of skin. Where I will use it is, let's say I wanted to have dirt on the character's skin. Dirt doesn't have subsurface attributes, so that would be perfect to add a dirt map and plug it into the diffuse color. But I don't think that this head texture map contributes to the subsurface characteristics that we're going for. So I'm going to disconnect that map and turn our diffuse weight to 0. I'm only going to use subsurface scattering weight. So I'm going to bump that up to 1, and it's going to overblow a little bit. But this leads me into another kind of rule of thumb when it comes to this tri-layer type of skin shading. And if we look down here at our subsurface weights, we have the shallow weight at 0.5, the mid weight at 0.5, and then the deep weight at 1. But the thing is, each of these 3 layers needs to combine to create one unified skin quality. But right now we have 1 plus 0.5 plus 0.5, which gives us a value of 2. So a common rule of thumb with these tri-layer materials is to keep the weights of each subsurface layer when they're added together to equal 1. So let's do that now with deep subsurface weight. Let's go to, let's say 0.2 there, which leaves 0.8 total to split between shallow and mid. So let's change that to 0.4 and 0.4. Now they combine to equal 1. And hopefully you can see over here in the preview render that we're getting less and less blown out, and our values are starting to make a little bit more sense. Something else to keep in mind though is way down at the bottom we have this setting called Use Screen Mode. And if we turn that off, you'll notice that our shader gets a little bit more blown out. And this is because by default, or I guess with this turned off, our subsurface layers are being added together the same way as when you add a add shader node compared to a mix shader node. Typically mix shader is more physically correct and add shader is not physically correct. So that's something to keep in mind because that can result in overblown subsurface values. However, if we change this to 1, each layer is no longer being added, but instead being screened. So that kind of clamps it at a 1 value, if you will. And at this point, we should be able to dial in our scale value a little bit easier. So let's change that from 0.2. Let's go to, let's say, 0.1. I think that looks pretty good. But now let's address the colors of our subsurface layers, namely the top 2. So with this image texture that I've already used, I'm going to replace the image with this map called SSS Epid, which stands for epidermal, the highest layer of skin. And we'll click on that, and you'll notice that if we, well, let's see it by itself. Input, no, not input, shader emission. You can see that it is more of a purple tone. It's supposed to be desaturated, but I took it even into the purple direction, which reflects what's happening in the default color of the shallow SSS swatch. If we click on that, it's basically white, but it is creeping towards the purple spectrum. So my map and whatever map you create should be a similar color. So let's plug that into the shallow SSS color swatch and see what that does for our shader. which it made it orange. So that's a little odd. How about we go ahead and add the mid color texture. Shift Control D to duplicate the image texture node and maintain its previous connections. And then go find my sub D map, which stands for subdermal. And as you can tell with this one, let's look at it by itself. It's a very saturated orangish red color, which doesn't reflect exactly what's happening over here in the mid SSS color swatch by default. But let's plug it in to see how it reacts with the other one. And when they're combined together, you know, it's in the right direction, but it's definitely too reddish orange and too saturated in general for the skin. It looks like he's been baking in a tanning booth for way too long. So what we can do here is manually manipulate each of these color maps as we want to. But first, let's just try adjusting the weights of these subsurface layers. So let's change the shallow. Let's give it a little bit more influence. Let's go to 0.6 and then decrease the mid weight to 0.2. See what that does for us. Okay, so that's giving us a little bit more purple and kind of desaturating the overall skin. I think it still could use a little bit of manual tweaking, so we'll do that with a color hue saturation node. And for this top one, let's decrease the saturation from 1 to 0.6, and then increase the value to 1.5. Okay, and then duplicate this node and plug it in to our mid-level texture map. Though let's keep the saturation at 1 and simply increase the value, or actually keep the value at 1.5. He still looks a little bit too saturated. Let's continue going down in saturation on both maps. Then how about we readjust the weights? Shallow, let's take it down to 0.5, and then mid weight up to 0.3. Yeah, I think that looks a little bit more natural. Let's see, as far as deep SSS color goes, you certainly can paint a map for it, but since we have it all the way down at 0.2, it's not contributing a ton to the overall subsurface look, so I'm just going to leave it at the default red color, and this is the deepest color, obviously based on the label of the setting, so typically this is a dark red color, and I'm going to leave it as is. Keep in mind that for each of these SSS layers, you have radiuses that you can control. This is what gives you very, very fine control over exactly what the subsurface is doing. So they have default set up. I'm just going to leave them there for the sake of time. But it is very nice that we have that amount of control. Let's move on to the specular settings down here. And in order to start tweaking those, I'm going to simply turn off my subsurface weight. I'll go down to 0 and re-enable my primary glossy weight first. Let's make that 0.6, which I think is the default. And here we have reflections, but as far as the reflection color, supporting what I said in the first lesson is the specular color for skin tends to be in the blue direction, which is true here. We can, of course, plug in a texture map here, which I will do the same way I did in the first lesson. So let's go grab that map, specular down here. And okay, so if we just plug this into the primary gloss color, we'll lose that blue value. So let's hover over this color, Control C to copy it, and then add a color mix RGB node and paste that color into both swatches. Now for this upper swatch, I'm going to decrease the value a little bit, keeping it the same color, but dragging its value down, which will break up the monotony of the surface. Let's plug the color of our image texture into the factor, and just to show you exactly what this is doing, I'll plug it into the emission. So you can see here that around the eyebrows and the beard and just the general darker areas, we won't get as much specular reflection. So now this can go into the primary gloss color. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can start to see that breakup happening. But if we want to see more, we just simply decrease the value. There we go. Now we're really starting to see how the map is affecting that specular color. And I'll be happy with that. Now for the other gloss settings, we have a primary gloss bump where we can plug in a specific bump map for this glossy layer. We can also do a different map for the secondary gloss bump, and we can also put in a specific diffuse color bump map, which again, going back to the dirt on the face, that could benefit from having a different bump map from the rest of the skin. But in this case, since it's a clean face, we can simply do what we did with the simplistic shader and duplicate an image texture node, go grab our bump map, and plug this into the displacement. So this is the same as the last lesson. I don't really have a need for multiple unique bump maps in this case, but I do need to add a converter math node, change the operation to multiply, and the value, let's go to 0.1. We need it to be nowhere near as strong as it just was. Perhaps a little bit more. Let's go to 0.2. See how that's showing up. Maybe even a little bit more than that. Let's go to 0.4. There we go. I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, back to the specular settings, or rather the primary gloss settings. Below the bump map, we have primary gloss roughness, and this works just like it does in the glossy. If we go down, he will get shinier, and potentially you could see this as being more sweaty, but I like a value of 0.2 for this one. And now for the primary Fresnel coefficient, this is where we dial in our Fresnel characteristic. So let's just test what it looks like at 0.1. You can see here that the reflection on the surface that's facing more directly to the camera, that nearly goes away entirely, whereas if we take the coefficient up to 0.9, all of the head starts to reflect a little bit more. So let's plug this into, how about 0.5? Yeah, I mean, that's right in the middle, so I think that's a fairly good value to work with. And that's it for the primary gloss settings. Then we move on to the secondary gloss settings, which are identical to the primary, but the secondary gloss does look a little bit different from the primary. I mean, as you would expect, why else would you have two gloss settings? So let's remember our primary gloss weight at 0.6 and then turn it off so we can concentrate solely on the secondary gloss. Let's bump that weight up to 0.5. And what you'll notice about this one is the roughness is much higher. And this kind of gives it a velvety kind of look. So in my opinion, the secondary gloss might not even be necessary. But if I was to justify it, I would say that it represents the very fine hairs that grow all over a person's face. I think that's sort of the point of the secondary gloss. So I'm going to go ahead and keep the settings as is, perhaps take down some of the Fresnel coefficient. Let's go down to 0.2. Yeah, let's just do that. It's not going to contribute a whole lot, but it can give that effect of the fuzziness of someone's face. So now that we have each individual gloss component dialed in, let's try to combine them. We'll take a primary up to 0.6, which is where I had it. And a secondary, let's take that down to, let's say 0.3. Yeah, I think that'll work nice. And now when we bring back our subsurface weight, let's bump that up to 1. And at this point, we've addressed everything in the shader. So let's start to do some comparisons to the simplistic skin shader as far as render time and look. Let's look at our render settings, 800 by 800, 50%, and render at 1,000, or samples at 1,000. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that's not looking too bad. Off the top of my head, perhaps I would decrease the scale of the subsurface a little bit. It's shining through the ears, I think, perhaps a bit too much. I could, of course, plug in the scale texture map that I used in the first lesson the exact same way. But also I'd like to increase the specularity. There's just not enough in my opinion. But as far as render time, we're at 3 minutes and 26 seconds. So let's switch to slot 4 and then apply the simple material, which I may need to append. I do. So let's add a fake user to the skin complex material and then append my simple material from the previous scene file that I recorded with. Here we go. Now let's render this. And I just realized that I never actually added the simple material to my object. There we go. Now let's render it. And that one looks pretty overblown. Let's see. So this is the complex and this is the simple. You know, I wonder, let's take a look at my layers. Yeah, I've been rendering with all 3 lighting setups. So let's turn off A and C. Yeah, and let's just render B by itself. Yeah, that's much better. So here it is with a simplistic shader. Here's the complex shader. I'll go back and forth between those a couple times. And the first thing that strikes me is with the complex shader, once you break down the skin color into multiple layers, it becomes a little bit more of a job to recombine those layers through the shader so that it looks realistic and natural. So I would want to spend a lot more time tweaking those colors because with a simplistic, it looks like a more believable flesh tone. And then with the complex, you know, it looks like his lips are very purple and like he's really, really cold or something. So that definitely needs some work. Also, the subsurface scale is a little bit too large with the complex shader, I think. But in general, you know, I think I'm fairly happy with it, at least for demonstrational purposes. One of the more important things to notice about this is with the simplistic shader, we're at 2 minutes and 24 seconds. And then with the complex shader, we're at 3 minutes and 36 seconds. So that's a fairly substantial render time increase. And remember that this is the actual resolution at 50%. So you can imagine that once we enlarge the render resolution, that the render time will increase and the extra render time with the complex shader will start to add up. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. But also don't forget that the purpose for the complex skin shader is you have a lot more control to really finely tune your subsurface skin shading to be exactly what you want. And that's going to be all for this tutorial. I hope through these lessons you have a much better idea of how to tackle realistic skin with the Cycles render engine. And I hope I've explained well enough the features of the simple subsurface shading node as well as the complex skin shader from Matthew Heimlich so that you can tackle any skin shading task you can imagine. Thanks for watching.